One night at exactly 8:17 p.m. in Richmond, Virginia, I was standing in the rain outside my own front door with a casserole dish in my hands and a voicemail from my sister-in-law telling the rest of my family not to let me inside. And if you have ever had one ordinary evening split your life into a before and an after, stay with me, because that was the minute I realized my mother had been buried with one secret too many. I had gone to the cemetery that evening because I could not bear the house. It had been 3 days since my mother's funeral, and every room in that little brick colonial on Hawthorne Avenue still felt full of her, without actually holding her anymore. Her robe still hung behind the bathroom door. Her reading glasses still rested on the side table beside the sofa. There was a dent in the kitchen chair where she liked to sit with her tea and do crossword puzzles in blue ink. Grief is strange that way. It is not just sadness. It is 1,000 practical absences arranged inside familiar rooms. My name is Lydia Mercer. I am 53 years old, and until that April, I believed I understood my family. Not perfectly. No one understands family perfectly. But I thought I knew where everyone stood. I thought I knew which grudges were old enough to be harmless, which silences meant peace instead of plotting, which smiles were genuine, and which were only tired. I was wrong about almost all of it. That Sunday night, after leaving fresh tulips at my mother's grave, I drove home through a drizzle so fine it looked like mist on the windshield. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, the kind of Sunday quiet that feels almost respectful. I remember thinking that maybe, finally, I would be able to sleep. Maybe the shock had begun to settle into something I could carry. Then I pulled into the driveway and saw my brother Stephen's truck parked across the curb, partly blocking the entrance. My first thought was simple confusion. Stephen had been avoiding me since the funeral luncheon. He had hugged me stiffly at the church, refused to meet my eyes, and then spent most of the reception talking in low tones with his wife, Marlene, and our younger sister, Deanna. When I approached them, the conversation stopped. At the time, I told myself grief made people odd. It was easier than assuming the truth. I carried the casserole dish from the church ladies' committee up the walk, balancing it on one hand while fishing my keys out of my purse. That was when I heard voices inside the house. Multiple voices. Not soft, either. Furniture moving, a drawer slamming. Marlene's laugh, sharp, triumphant, completely out of place in a house that still smelled faintly of funeral lilies. I unlocked the door and had barely turned the knob when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I almost ignored it. I wish I had. Instead, I glanced down and saw a voicemail notification from Marlene, time-stamped 2 minutes earlier. Before I could even think, the message began to transcribe across the screen. Don't answer if Lydia comes back. Stephen said not to let her in until Mr. Kessler gets here. We need to finish checking the study first. For one long second, I just stood there, rain dripping from my hairline, cold casserole dish in my hand, my own key in my own lock, and something in me turned very still. I opened the door. The first thing I saw was my mother's china cabinet standing open, every shelf half empty. The second thing I saw was Deanna kneeling on the rug with a file box at her feet, sorting envelopes into piles. The third thing I saw was Marlene in my mother's dining room, holding my grandmother's silver cake server up to the chandelier light, as though she were examining jewelry at an estate auction. Nobody looked especially surprised to see me. That may have been the worst part. Stephen came out of the hallway with a stack of folders in his arms and stopped dead in the foyer. The folders tilted. One slid to the floor. He set his jaw the way he always had when he was about to pretend he was being reasonable. You weren't supposed to be here yet, he said. I put the casserole dish down on the hall table so carefully that the glass barely made a sound. In my house? I asked. Marlene clicked her tongue softly, like I was being difficult in public. Lydia, no one's trying to upset you. We're just handling some things before you complicate them. That sentence still lives in me. Before you complicate them. I had been sleeping in that house for the last 11 months, ever since my mother's stroke. I had fed her, bathed her, argued with insurance companies for her, sat beside her hospital bed at St. Mary's in Richmond, and held the straw while she learned how to drink again. I had become so familiar with the sound of her nighttime cough that I woke before she did. And now my sister-in-law, who had visited twice in 6 months and spent both afternoons complaining about traffic, was telling me not to complicate things. Deanna rose slowly from the rug, pressing a folder to her stomach. Lydia, please don't start. I laughed then. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes that is what comes out when the truth arrives too fast. Start what? I asked. What exactly am I starting? Coming home? Stephen set the stack of folders on the console table as if making a point of his own calm. We found some documents after the funeral. There are legal matters that need to be sorted out. Mr. Kessler is on his way. Mr. Kessler? I repeated. Mother's attorney? Yes. Then why am I finding you in her study going through papers like burglars? It's not burglary if it's family, Marlene said. I looked at her, really looked at her, her coat still on, her lipstick untouched, rain boots spotless. She had dressed for business, not mourning. My brother sighed like a man carrying a heavy burden. Mother made some decisions near the end, he said. We're trying to understand them before you overreact. That was the first time I felt it clearly. Not grief, not anger, but betrayal. It was almost clean, a cold line through my chest. Let me see the documents, I said. No, Stephen said too quickly. There are moments in life when one word opens a trapdoor beneath everything you thought was stable. That no did it, because if this had been confusion or caution or genuine legal concern, he would have handed me the papers. If this had been about our mother, we would have been reading them together. His refusal told me there was already a battle underway, and I had entered the room late. I took one step forward. Move. Stephen didn't. Deanna looked frightened. Marlene, unbelievably, looked annoyed. We're only trying to protect what's rightfully Stephen's, she said, and then the room itself seemed to tilt. I stared at her. What did you just say? No one answered immediately. That told me more than words. What? I repeated, quieter this time. Did you just say? Marlene folded her arms. She had always been one of those women who mistook bluntness for strength. Your mother wasn't in her right mind toward the end, and we're not going to let one last-minute emotional decision ruin everything. I remember hearing the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a car rolled past slowly on the wet street. My whole body felt hollow and hot at the same time. My mother knew exactly what she was doing, I said. Stephen rubbed a hand over his mouth. That's the problem, Lydia. She may have known exactly what she was doing. I wish I could tell you that was the beginning. It wasn't. The beginning had happened years earlier, so gradually I mistook it for ordinary family wear and tear. My mother, Evelyn Mercer, had 3 children. Stephen, the oldest, was the one people trusted first because he had a broad face, a calm voice, and a habit of nodding before he spoke, as if he were carefully weighing every angle. Deanna, 6 years younger than him and 4 younger than me, was the peacemaker. She learned early that harmony could be manufactured if you apologized often enough, even when nothing had been repaired. And I was the one who stayed. That became my role long before I realized it had happened. I married at 26. My husband Neil and I moved to Charlotte because of his work in commercial insurance. We were happy in the decent, busy way many marriages are before time shows you what can be bent and what cannot. We had one son, Caleb. We paid our mortgage. We hosted Thanksgiving twice. We thought we were building something permanent. Then Neil fell in love with a woman in his office at 48 and announced, with almost insulting sincerity, that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. By the time the divorce was final in 2016, Caleb was in graduate school in Chicago and I was living alone in a townhouse that echoed at night. My mother called every evening around 7:30. She never asked directly whether I was lonely. She asked what I'd made for dinner, whether I'd seen the cardinal in the dogwood outside her kitchen window again, whether I thought she should get the gutters cleaned before winter. That was her way of loving me. She gave me things to answer so I wouldn't have to answer larger questions. Then, in May of 2023, she had the stroke. It was not the kind that kills you cleanly. It was the kind that rearranges everything and leaves you alive enough to see what has changed. Stephen flew in from Atlanta and stayed 3 days. Deanna came down from Baltimore for a weekend and cried in the hospital chapel. Both of them meant well, in the vague and exhausting way people often do. But when the rehab center started talking about long-term care, medication schedules, bathroom assistance, and the cost of in-home nursing, their voices changed. "Well," Stephen said over speakerphone one night, "we have to be realistic." Realistic is one of those words that rarely brings mercy with it. At first, the plan was temporary. I would move in for a little while, just until our mother regained more strength. My remote bookkeeping work meant I had flexibility. I could bring my laptop. I could stay through the summer. Stephen promised he would come every other weekend. Deanna said she'd take over by fall if needed. Neither promise lasted 6 weeks. By August, my mother could walk slowly with a cane, but still needed help bathing, dressing, sorting medications, and getting in and out of bed when her left side stiffened. Stephen's visits became monthly, then occasional. Deanna sent grocery deliveries and texted heart emojis and called herself useless at the hands-on stuff, which was a neat sentence because it sounded like confession while functioning as refusal. I stayed. At first, I told myself it was because I could. Then because I had already rearranged my life. Then because my mother would look at me some evenings with a tired gratitude that made leaving feel cruel. And there was another truth, too. I wanted to be there. Not every minute of it. Not the adult diapers and insurance holds and 4 a.m. confusion. But the closeness of those months carried something holy in it. When someone's life narrows, your presence stops being symbolic. It becomes practical. You are the hand under the elbow, the tea brought exactly the way they like it, the witness to who they are when dignity becomes effort instead of assumption. I learned things about my mother during that year that I had never known. She hated peppermint tea but drank it for years because my father liked the smell. She had once wanted to move to Nova Scotia after retirement because she'd seen a photograph of Peggy's Cove in a magazine and decided any place that looked that lonely must be peaceful. She cried every time she heard Moon River, though she would deny it if asked. She was funnier than I remembered. Sharper, too. Illness can strip away performance. By November, she had no patience left for anyone's nonsense, including mine. "Stephen talks in circles when he wants money," she told me one Tuesday afternoon while I trimmed her nails at the kitchen table. I looked up. "Has he asked you for money?" "He doesn't ask. He narrates his stress until you offer." I nearly laughed, but she looked too serious. "Has he been doing that?" She shrugged, and the shrug told me yes. Later, I found out he had borrowed against his business twice in the last 2 years. A restaurant supply company he had invested in had gone under. He didn't tell us, naturally. Stephen never admitted trouble unless he could cast himself as noble inside it. The first real crack came in January 2024. My mother had a good day that Sunday, clear-minded, hungry, chatty. I made roast chicken and mashed potatoes because she used to make them for every birthday in our family, and she said, after 2 bites, "This tastes more like my mother's than mine." It was the sort of sentence that should have passed like warmth. Instead, Stephen, who had actually shown up for dinner that evening, laughed and said, "Well, Lydia's had enough practice pretending to run this house." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. My mother set her napkin down. "What does that mean?" Stephen smiled, but there was something mean underneath it. "It means she's very comfortable here." I said, "I'm sorry, is there somewhere else you'd like me to be while I help your mother bathe?" Deanna jumped in immediately. "Can we not do this?" But my mother was looking at Stephen in a way I had not seen since childhood, when one of us lied poorly. "Say what you mean," she told him. He hesitated. That was unusual for him. "I just think," he said, "there should be some clarity. That's all." "About what?" I asked. "About the house." The room went silent. My mother lived in that house for 41 years. My father bought it in 1983, 2 years before he made manager at the paper mill in Chesterfield County. When he died, he left it to her without contest because there was nothing to contest. It wasn't grand. 3 bedrooms, 1 study, 1 narrow sunroom, old pine floors upstairs. But the neighborhood had changed. Richmond had expanded. Young families wanted the school district. Real estate people had begun leaving handwritten notes in her mailbox offering cash today. "It's my house," my mother said. Stephen held up both hands. "I know that." "Then what clarity do you need?" He looked at me instead of her. "I just think, when the time comes, there should be a fair plan." I felt something cold move through me even then. My mother stared at him for a long moment. Then she pushed her plate away and said, "If the time comes and I'm still breathing, I'll make the plan myself." Nobody spoke for the rest of dinner. The next morning, while I helped her button her cardigan, she said, "Call Martin Kessler." "Your attorney?" "Yes." "Do you want me to set an appointment?" "I want you to sit in the room when I do." I looked at her in the mirror. Her hair had gone almost entirely silver after the stroke. Her face looked softer, but her eyes had not changed at all. "Are you sure?" "Lydia," she said, "I am not senile. I am angry. There's a difference." I called that day. Martin Kessler had been my parents' attorney for almost 30 years. He had helped them refinance after my father's layoff in the 90s, drafted my mother's first will after my father died, and closed 2 ugly property disputes for half the neighborhood. He came to the house 3 days later, on January 18th, at exactly 2 p.m., carrying a legal pad and wearing the kind of navy overcoat that suggested he had never once in his life dressed in a hurry. He greeted my mother first, then me, and sat at the kitchen table while I poured coffee. "Evelyn tells me she'd like to update a few things," he said. My mother looked directly at him. "Not a few things, everything." He glanced at me briefly, then back to her. "All right." What followed lasted almost 2 hours. I remained because she insisted, but I did not speak unless addressed. She was calm. More than calm. Precise. She asked specific questions about powers of attorney, about care decisions if she became cognitively impaired, about liquid assets, about the house. At one point, she stopped and looked at me. "You understand this isn't about rewarding anyone," she said. "It's about fairness and reality." "I understand." "And about gratitude," she added quietly. I wanted to tell her she didn't owe me gratitude for loving her. But Martin was there, and I could already feel that whatever was happening in that room needed dignity more than emotion. When he left, the draft would be ready in a week. After he was gone, I found my mother staring out the kitchen window at the damp backyard. "Are you all right?" I asked. She nodded. Then, after a moment, she said, "Children spend the first half of your life needing you, and the second half misremembering you." I sat down across from her. "Do you want to tell me what you're thinking?" She smiled without looking at me. "I'm thinking your brother has his father's smile and none of his father's patience. I'm thinking Deanna confuses softness with goodness. And I'm thinking I should have been clearer with all of you years ago." "About what?" "About what counts." I didn't understand then. Not fully. I do now. By February, her health declined faster. The second stroke was smaller, but crueler. It did not take her speech entirely, but it left her tired after even short conversations, and fatigue made her forgetful in ways that frightened her. She began sleeping in the downstairs guest room because the stairs felt dangerous. Some mornings she woke disoriented and asked where my father was. One afternoon she thought Caleb was still 12. Those were the weeks my siblings became suddenly attentive. Deanna called daily. Stephen started visiting again, always with flowers and concern and practical questions delivered too smoothly. "Have the property taxes been paid this year? Did Martin ever bring back those revised papers? Have you thought about what you'll do when the house needs to be sold?" Each question wore the clothing of responsibility. The body underneath was greed. I never told my mother everything he said. A daughter still wants to protect even the parent who is dying. Then came the conversation in the hallway, the one that later I would understand as the true beginning of the end. It was March 3rd, 2024, around 6:40 p.m. I had just come back from the pharmacy. My mother was asleep. I heard voices near the study before I stepped fully into the foyer. Stephen and Marlene were inside with the door half open. Marlene said, "If she leaves the house to Lydia, you know we can contest it." Stephen replied, "Only if we can prove incompetence." "And can we?" A pause. "Maybe not directly," he said, "but we can create enough doubt to force a settlement." I stood so still my hands started shaking from the effort of not moving. Marlene lowered her voice, but I still heard her. "Then stop waiting. Talk to your mother now while she still feels guilty." That sentence did something to me. Not because it was cruel, though it was, because it revealed how neatly they had arranged morality in their own minds. In their story, my mother's gratitude for my care was not gratitude. It was guilt. My being there was not sacrifice. It was strategy. They needed that version of events to live with themselves. I pushed the door open then. They both startled. Stephen straightened too quickly. "You're back." "Yes," I said. "Clearly." Marlene smiled the way people smile when caught doing something indefensible, and they decide charm is the cheapest exit. "We were just making sure your mother has everything she needs." "In the study?" I asked. Stephen snapped before he could stop himself. "Why do you always make everything sound dirty?" "Because it is," I thought, but I only said, "Get out." He stared at me a long time. Then he laughed once, short and humorless. "You really think this house is yours already, don't you?" "My mother is still alive." "That's not what I asked." That was the first time he said it plainly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He stepped closer. "You moved in here and suddenly became indispensable. Do you think nobody notices?" I was so angry, I became calm. Truly calm. The kind that scares other people because it has no useful opening for them. "You're confusing presence with manipulation," I said. That says more about you than me. Marlene touched his arm. Let's go. He stared another second, then left. But the look he gave me before stepping past was not a brother's anger. It was a rival's. I told Martin Kessler about that conversation the next morning. He listened without interrupting and then asked one question. Would your mother be willing to sign the final documents this week? She's tired, I said. But yes, if it matters. It matters. He came on Thursday, March 7th, with 2 witnesses from his office. My mother sat at the kitchen table in her blue cardigan and signed every page with a hand that trembled but did not hesitate. She looked up at him when she was done and said, If anyone tells you later I didn't understand what I was signing, they're lying. He gave her a solemn nod. I'll remember that. Afterward, when the witnesses had left and I was making tea, she called me back to the table. Sit down, she said. I did. She took my hand, and even then, with all the weakness in her body, her grip still had intention. Whatever happens after I'm gone, she said, promise me you won't apologize for what you did for me. My throat tightened. I wouldn't. Yes, you would. You always do. Promise me anyway. I nodded. I promise. She squeezed once more and released my hand. 3 weeks later, she died in her sleep at 4:11 in the morning while rain tapped against the windows. Peacefully, the doctor said. I don't know whether that word comforts the living or the dead more. The funeral was on Thursday, April 11th, at St. Andrew's Episcopal in Richmond. My mother loved order, so it was beautiful in the tidy way she would have wanted. White roses, hymns she chose years earlier, a luncheon in the fellowship hall with ham biscuits, pound cake, and people saying things like, she was such a dignified woman, as if dignity were somehow a substitute for being loved. Stephen gave a eulogy full of polished memories that made him sound more attentive than he had been. Deanna cried sincerely, which I do not hold against her. Grief and weakness are not the same thing, and for a long time I failed to distinguish them in her. What I noticed most, though, was the way they kept drifting together. Stephen, Marlene, Deanna, and even Thomas Kearney, Marlene's brother, a real estate agent from Midlothian, who had no earthly reason to be part of any family conversation that day. Their heads bent close, their bodies turning away when I approached. At the time, exhaustion saved me from understanding quickly. Sometimes the mind gives mercy in the form of delay. Then came that Sunday night, the changed emotional weather in the house, the china cabinet open, Marlene's voicemail, Stephen's refusal to hand me the papers, and Andrew Keller in the story I'm telling you tonight, walking in at exactly 9:34 p.m. and changing the shape of the room by simply existing inside it. The reality was this. My mother had not just revised her will. She had transferred the house into a trust 3 weeks before she died, with me as sole trustee and beneficiary upon her passing, along with the liquid accounts set aside specifically for maintenance, taxes, and legal defense should any challenge arise. Martin had advised her that the cleanest way to prevent drawn-out probate warfare was to make the transfer while she was still unmistakably competent and document every step. She did more than that. She wrote a letter. I had not known about the letter until Martin placed the envelope in my hand that Sunday night. He told me later she'd dictated most of it herself and insisted it be read aloud only if the family made a disgrace of themselves. That was her phrase. She had a wicked streak under all that gentility, and it emerged late in life like a gift. I opened the envelope with fingers that suddenly did not feel like mine. The paper inside was crisp and heavy. Her handwriting, though shaky, was unmistakable. To my children, it began. The room seemed to contract around those words. If this letter is being read, then some of you have mistaken my death for an opportunity. I glanced up. Stephen had gone pale. Deanna looked as if she might faint. Marlene stood very straight, which told me she was rattled. Martin asked quietly, "Would you like me to read it?" I handed it to him. He did not theatricalize it. That would have cheapened everything. He simply read in a calm, measured voice that somehow made every sentence sharper. To my children. If this letter is being read, then some of you have mistaken my death for an opportunity. Let me save us all time. I was of sound mind. I knew exactly what I was signing, exactly when I signed it, and exactly why. He turned the page. Lydia lived with me, cared for me, and gave up the quiet privacy of her own life to make the end of mine livable. She did not do this for reward. She did it because she loved me. That is precisely why I have chosen to reward her. I felt my breath catch. Stephen, if you tell yourself she manipulated me, you insult me, not her. Deanna, if you say nothing because silence feels easier, remember that ease is not innocence. Deanna made a soft sound then, almost like a whimper. Martin continued. This house is not a family trophy. It is a home, and the child who understood that distinction has already proved herself. Nothing in my estate is to be contested, negotiated, or clarified by anyone who could not be bothered to wash my hair, argue with Medicare on my behalf, or sit beside me when I was frightened. Marlene moved first. This is unbelievable. Martin did not look at her. There's another page. He read the last part, even more quietly. If you are in my house when this letter is heard, removing items or pressuring Lydia in any way, then you have confirmed every fear I had. Leave immediately, and if there is any decency left in you, be ashamed before you are angry. When he finished, the silence was so complete I could hear rainwater ticking from the gutter outside. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Stephen said, "She wouldn't have written that without help." It was such a predictable thing to say that I almost laughed. Martin closed the letter neatly and placed it back on the table. She dictated portions of it in front of me and 2 witnesses on March 21st, he said. The video recording is on file with my office. Would you like to challenge it? It was beautifully done, that question. Not hostile, just expensive. Stephen's mouth opened, then closed. Marlene tried next. This is emotional coercion. No, Martin said. This is documentation. Then he looked at the movers, 2 young men who had spent the last 10 minutes doing their best impression of wallpaper. Gentlemen, he said, you've been hired under false pretenses. I suggest you place every item exactly where you found it and leave with your invoice unpaid until Mr. Mercer explains why you were assisting in unlawful removal from trust property. They moved immediately. That was when the theater of reversal began, and I will admit something that may not flatter me. It satisfied me more than I expected. The same hands that carried out my grandmother's silver returned it to the sideboard. The lamp came back. The dining room drawers were refilled. Thomas Kearney, real estate opportunist and family parasite, tried once to mumble that he was only here in an advisory capacity, which caused Martin to say, "Then advise yourself to leave." He did. Marlene attempted tears. Grace would have made them elegant. Marlene's were pure strategy. Deanna stood in the middle of the room looking like a person who had finally discovered that neutrality also leaves a stain. Stephen was the hardest to read. He did not apologize. Men like him rarely do when apology would require demotion in their own minds. But something in his face had slackened. For the first time in my life, he looked ordinary. Before they left, he tried one last thing. "This isn't what Mom wanted," he said quietly. And because I was tired and because the truth had finally become simple, I answered him with the calmest voice I had used all night. "No," I said, "this is exactly what she wanted. What you mean is it isn't what you wanted." He looked at me, then at the hallway, then at the front door. And because he had no sentence big enough to make himself the victim again, he left in silence. After the last car pulled away and the mover's taillights disappeared at the corner, the house became impossibly still. Martin stayed another half hour, reviewing next steps, leaving copies, giving me the practical comfort of legal language. Contest periods, notice requirements, change of locks, inventory. He spoke softly, but not delicately. Delicate was for people you expected to collapse. He spoke to me like someone already standing. As he put on his coat, he said, "Your mother was very clear-eyed." I nodded. She usually was. He smiled faintly. "Call me if they try anything else." "I will." Then he paused by the door and added, "For what it's worth, she was very proud of you." After he left, I sat on the living room floor because I did not trust my knees. Not because I was defeated, because the fight had ended before my body got the message. I cried then, quietly, face in my hands. Not dramatic grief, not triumph. Something stranger than both. Relief can make you ache in places anger never reaches. The days that followed were a slow return, not to normal. There is no return to normal after loss, only movement into a version of life that eventually stops feeling counterfeit. I changed the locks on Monday morning. I boxed up my mother's medications on Tuesday. On Wednesday, I found one of her grocery lists folded inside a cookbook and had to sit down at the kitchen table for 20 minutes because it felt unbearable that a person could exist so thoroughly in pencil marks and yet be gone. Deanna came by the following Saturday, alone for once. She stood on the porch at 11:06 a.m. with no makeup on, and a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was 16 and had backed my father's Buick into a mailbox. "I know you don't want to see me," she said. "That's not true," I replied. "I just don't know what version of you is here." That hurt her. Good. Some pain is clarifying. We sat at the kitchen table where our mother had signed those final papers. Deanna cried, really cried this time, not soft and decorative, but ugly and ashamed. She told me Stephen had been pressuring her for weeks, saying our mother was confused, that he needed her support in case there was a dispute, that the house was the only thing of real value, and would just trap Lydia in grief anyway. "I didn't agree," she said. "I just didn't stop him." "Yes," I replied. "That's what the letter said, too." She flinched. "I was scared," she whispered. "Of Stephen? Of all of it. Of him being angry, of being the bad daughter, of choosing sides." I sat back and looked at her. "You did choose." That was the hardest thing I had said to her in our entire lives. Harder, I think, than she expected. People like Deanna build themselves on the belief that indecision keeps them kind. It doesn't. It just lets stronger people do their worst with borrowed permission. She nodded slowly. "I know." We did not reconcile that day. Reconciliation is not the prize for confession. But something honest began. That mattered more. Stephen did not come. He sent one email 3 weeks later through a different attorney, couched in language so polished it was almost abstract, inquiring whether I might be open to a family resolution that reflects broader expectations. Martin wrote back before I finished reading the first paragraph. The answer, in 12 elegant lines, was no. Then came the part none of them expected. The aftermath did not hollow me out. It clarified me. By early summer, I knew I was not leaving the house, not because my mother had left it to me, but because staying had become an act of witness. The hydrangeas along the side fence still needed pruning. The upstairs study still held my father's old drafting tools in a cherry box. My son, Caleb, came from Chicago in June and sat on the porch drinking beer with me after dinner while the fireflies rose over the hedge. "You're different," he said. "Older?" I asked. "Sharper." I thought about that. "Maybe just less confused," I said. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. In July, I used part of the account my mother had set aside to establish a small elder care advocacy fund in her name through the church. Nothing grand, just practical grants for in-home respite care, legal document preparation, transportation to specialist appointments, exactly the kind of help ordinary families postpone until crisis makes postponement impossible. When I announced it to the vestry board, I did not mention betrayal. I mentioned reality. How many daughters and sons carry parents through the medical maze alone? How quickly we should plan becomes it's too late. How dignity often depends less on money than on having one competent person in the room. The first grant went to a retired mechanic named Walter, who was caring for his wife with Parkinson's in Chester. The second went to a school librarian in Henrico, who needed legal help updating guardianship forms for her mother. Every time a check went out, I thought of my mother saying, "What counts?" There was one more surprise, though. Families like mine rarely run out of them neatly. In September, while cleaning the study properly for the first time, I found a false bottom in the lower left desk drawer. My father had built the desk himself in 1987. I knew every scratch on it. Or I thought I did. The panel lifted with the edge of a ruler, and underneath was a small bundle tied in blue ribbon. Letters. All from my father to my mother, written between 1979 and 1982 when he traveled for work. They were not scandalous. No hidden children, no secret fortune, nothing television-worthy. What they were, however, was intimate in a way that altered my understanding of both of them. My father, whom I had always remembered as practical to the point of plainness, wrote my mother sentences like, "I miss the way you stand in the kitchen window after dusk as if darkness were trying to persuade you of something." My mother kept every one of those letters for more than 40 years and never told any of us they existed. At the bottom of the bundle was a note in my mother's handwriting, undated. "Lydia, if you find these, it means you finally cleaned that drawer properly. Your father loved me with very few words in person, and too many on paper. Keep whichever version of us gives you the most peace." I laughed so hard I cried again. That note told me something profound. She had known me to the end. Known I would clean the study eventually. Known I would need one more small conversation with her after she was gone. We spend so much of grief searching for final messages that we sometimes miss the ones hidden in the ordinary habits of being known. The last time I saw Stephen in person was December 22nd, 2024, outside the Kroger on Carey Street Road at 5:48 in the evening. I had 2 bags of groceries and a poinsettia on the front seat. He was standing near the cart return with his collar turned up against the cold. Older, heavier, less certain. "Lydia," he said. I stopped. For a second, we simply looked at each other. We had the same father's eyes. That used to comfort me. It no longer did. "How are you?" he asked. It was such a useless question that I almost smiled. "I'm fine," I said. He nodded. "I heard about the fund. Mom would have liked that. She's the reason it exists." Another nod. Then after a pause, he said, "I wasn't myself." That was as close to apology as he could get without surrendering the story he told himself about who he was. I looked at him for a long time, long enough that he finally had to hold my gaze without performance. "You were exactly yourself," I said. "That was the problem." His face changed, but not into anger, into recognition. Painful, unwelcome recognition. I got into my car and drove away before either of us could make it uglier or easier than it was. Some endings do not need healing, they need accuracy. It is April again now as I tell you this. A year has passed. The dogwood outside the kitchen window is blooming. The chipped step is still chipped. I could fix it. I probably will. The wind chimes are still slightly crooked. Those I think I'll leave alone. Sometimes I still wake at 4:11 and lie there listening to the house settle. Sometimes I still expect to hear my mother cough from the guest room or call my name because the blanket slipped from her knees. Grief, for me, did not fade so much as change rooms. It no longer sits in the center of everything. But it is still in the house. So is love. And so, oddly enough, is justice. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that slams doors and humiliates villains with dramatic speeches. Real justice is often quieter than that. It is a legal envelope opened at the right time. It is a mother refusing to confuse blood with loyalty. It is a daughter learning that staying does not make you weak, and that speaking plainly after years of swallowing hurt can feel less like revenge and more like finally standing upright. Tonight, before bed, I'll probably sit on the porch for a few minutes the way I do most evenings. I'll listen to those crooked wind chimes and watch the streetlights come on one by one along Hawthorne Avenue. And I'll think, as I often do, about that Sunday night in the rain, the casserole dish, the changed air inside the house, the sentence on my phone that told me everything was already underway. If you'd been standing where I was, with your key in your hand and your family inside quietly replacing you, would you have walked away to keep the peace? Or would you have stepped through the door and forced the truth into the light? That's the part I'd really like to hear.